Sheriff Marcus Kane stood at the edge of the desert highway, watching the black SUVs disappear into the heat shimmer of the Arizona wasteland. The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the ever-present dust that coated everything in Copper Valley County. At 42, Kane had been sheriff for 8 years, and in that time, he had built a reputation as one of the most effective law enforcement officers in the state. What the public didn't know was that his effectiveness came at a price that would have shocked them to their core. "Clean this up," Kane ordered his deputy, Jake Morrison, gesturing toward the 3 bodies sprawled beside the overturned drug transport vehicle. "Make it look like a cartel-on-cartel hit. No survivors, no witnesses." Morrison, a 28 former Marine who had served under Kane since joining the department 3 years earlier, nodded without question. He had long since stopped asking about the moral implications of their actions. The money was too good, and Kane's explanations about fighting fire with fire had gradually worn down his resistance. Kane walked toward the abandoned transport truck, its cargo doors hanging open like the mouth of a mechanical beast. Inside, neatly stacked in military-grade cases, was more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. $34 million in cash, the proceeds from a major drug operation that had been moving product from Mexico through Arizona and into the broader American market. The operation Kane had just orchestrated wasn't a law enforcement action, it was a carefully planned heist. For the past 6 months, he had been tracking this particular cartel shipment, using his position as sheriff to gather intelligence, coordinate with corrupt contacts in Border Patrol, and plan the perfect intercept. To the outside world, it would appear that rival cartels had ambushed the transport. In reality, Kane and his hand-picked team of corrupt deputies had executed a military precision robbery. "Boss," called out Deputy Sarah Chen, Kane's most trusted lieutenant, "we've got the money loaded. What's our timeline?" Kane checked his watch. They had approximately 40 minutes before the first legitimate law enforcement response would arrive. He had carefully orchestrated the timing, ensuring that the 911 calls would be delayed and that he would be the primary responder to the crime scene. 15 minutes to finish the staging, then we're gone, Kane replied, his voice calm and professional, despite the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. Kane's transformation from legitimate law enforcement officer to criminal mastermind hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual descent that began 5 years earlier when his wife, Linda, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The medical bills had been crushing, even with insurance, and Kane had watched helplessly as their savings evaporated, and their home went into foreclosure. It was during this desperate period that Kane had first been approached by representatives of the Morales cartel. They offered him $50,000 to simply look the other way during a specific drug transport. Kane had initially refused, but as Linda's condition worsened and the bills mounted, his resolve had cracked. The first payment had been followed by others, each one larger than the last. Kane told himself he was just buying time, just trying to save his wife. But Linda had died anyway, and Kane found himself left with a crushing sense of guilt, a mountain of debt, and a taste for the easy money that corruption provided. "Marcus," Linda had whispered during her final days, "promise me you'll stay good. Promise me you won't let this destroy who you are." Kane had promised, but it was a promise he had broken within months of her death. The grief and anger had consumed him, and the cartel money had provided both an escape and a means of revenge against a world that had taken everything from him. Now, 5 years later, Kane was no longer just a corrupt cop taking bribes. He had evolved into something far more dangerous, a criminal mastermind who used his badge and authority to build his own empire. The $34 million in the truck represented the culmination of months of planning and the beginning of his transformation from corrupt sheriff to full-fledged crime boss. Sarah Kane called out, "I want you to coordinate with our contacts in Phoenix. We need to establish the money laundering pipeline immediately." Chen nodded, understanding the implications. This wasn't just about stealing money. It was about building the infrastructure to clean it and invest it in legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for future operations. Kane had spent years studying the cartels he was supposed to be fighting. He understood their weaknesses. They were often disorganized, prone to violence that attracted attention, and limited by their outsider status in American society. Kane, however, had advantages they could never possess. He had a badge, legal authority, and the trust of the community. He could operate in plain sight. using the very system he was supposed to protect as cover for his criminal activities. The plan that had been forming in Kane's mind for months was audacious in its scope. He would use the $34 million as seed money to build a criminal organization that operated like a legitimate business. Instead of relying on violence and intimidation like traditional cartels, Kane would use corruption, political influence, and economic power to control territory and eliminate competition. "Boss," Morrison called out, "we've got company coming up the highway." Kane looked through his binoculars and saw the approaching vehicles, legitimate law enforcement responding to the staged crime scene. Everything was proceeding according to planned positions. "Everyone," Kane ordered. "Remember, we're the first responders to a cartel massacre. Act accordingly." As the other law enforcement vehicles arrived, Kane slipped seamlessly into his role as the dedicated sheriff investigating a brutal crime. He coordinated the scene, directed the investigation, and provided quotes to the media about the ongoing war between drug cartels. "This is exactly the kind of violence we've been warning about," Kane told the assembled reporters that evening. "These cartels have no respect for human life, and they're bringing their wars to our communities. We need more resources, more support from the federal government, and stronger laws to fight this threat." The irony wasn't lost on Kane. He was using the very crime he had committed to justify increased funding and authority for his department, resources he would then use to expand his criminal operations. That night, in the privacy of his home office, Kane began planning the next phase of his transformation. The $34 million was just the beginning. He had identified several key areas where he could expand his influence: drug distribution, money laundering, illegal gambling, and protection rackets. But unlike traditional criminal organizations, Kane's operation would be built on a foundation of legitimacy and respectability. His first move would be to establish a network of legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for money laundering. Kane had already identified several opportunities: a chain of car washes, a construction company, and a series of real estate investments. These businesses would not only clean his money, but also provide employment for his growing network of corrupt law enforcement officers and criminal associates. Kane's phone rang, interrupting his planning. It was District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, a longtime ally who had no idea about Kane's criminal activities. "Marcus, I just heard about the cartel massacre. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Rebecca. Just another day in paradise," Kane replied, his voice carrying just the right note of weary dedication. "We need to talk about increasing security funding. This kind of violence is exactly why we need to expand your department's capabilities." Kane smiled. "I couldn't agree more. In fact, I've been working on some proposals that I think you'll find very interesting." As Kane hung up the phone, he reflected on how perfectly everything was falling into place. His reputation as a dedicated law enforcement officer was actually enhanced by the very crimes he was committing. Each cartel bust, each drug seizure, each act of violence he orchestrated only served to increase public support for his department and his methods. The transformation was complete in Kane's mind, even if the world hadn't realized it yet. Sheriff Marcus Kane, the grieving widower who had dedicated his life to fighting crime, was dead. In his place stood something far more dangerous: a criminal mastermind with a badge, unlimited authority, and $34 million in seed money to build an empire. But Kane's ambitions extended far beyond simple theft and corruption. He envisioned a criminal organization that operated like a Fortune 500 company, efficient, profitable, and virtually untouchable. He would use his position as sheriff to eliminate competition, protect his operations, and expand his territory. He would corrupt other law enforcement agencies, buy politicians, and build a network of legitimate businesses that could operate indefinitely without detection. The $34 million wasn't just stolen money, it was the foundation of a new kind of criminal empire, one that would make the traditional cartels look like amateur street gangs. And Marcus Kane, the corrupt sheriff who had lost everything and decided to take it all back, was just getting started as he sat in his office, surrounded by commendations and photos from his years of legitimate service. Kane began drafting the business plan that would transform him from a corrupt cop into the most powerful crime boss in the American Southwest. The irony that he would use his law enforcement expertise to build a criminal empire wasn't lost on him. It was exactly what made his plan so brilliant and so dangerous. 6 months after the highway heist, Sheriff Marcus Kane stood in the conference room of Desert Vista Construction, one of the legitimate businesses he had purchased with his stolen cartel money. The room was filled with men and women who, to any outside observer, appeared to be ordinary business executives and law enforcement professionals. In reality, they were the core leadership of Kane's rapidly expanding criminal empire. "Our Q2 numbers are impressive," announced Elena Vasquez, Kane's newly appointed chief financial officer, a former D accountant who had been quietly recruited. After discovering irregularities in federal drug seizure funds, the car wash chain is processing approximately $2 million per month in dirty money, with a clean return rate of 85%. Kane nodded approvingly. The car wash operation had been his first major money laundering success. By purchasing a struggling chain of automated car washes throughout Arizona and New Mexico, he had created the perfect vehicle for cleaning drug money. The businesses were cash-intensive, had high-volume transactions, and operated in multiple jurisdictions, making them difficult for any single law enforcement agency to monitor effectively. "What about the construction contracts?" Kane asked, turning to Miguel Santos, a former cartel lieutenant who had defected to Kane's organization. "After recognizing the superior structure and protection it offered, we've secured the contracts for 3 major highway projects and 2 municipal buildings," Santos reported. "Total value is $47 million over the next 18 months. The beauty is that we're actually doing the work. We're just using the projects to justify large cash movements and employ our people in legitimate positions." This was Kane's masterstroke. Unlike traditional criminal organizations that operated entirely outside the law, Kane's empire was built on a foundation of legitimate businesses that actually provided real services. This approach served multiple purposes. It generated genuine revenue, provided cover for criminal activities, and created a network of legitimate employment for his criminal associates. "Sarah, update me on law enforcement integration," Kane said, addressing Deputy Sarah Chen, who had become his director of operations. "We now have assets in 12 different agencies across 4 states, Chen reported. Border Patrol, D, FBI, State Police, and multiple sheriff's departments. Our monthly protection payments total $800,000, but the intelligence and operational security we receive in return is invaluable." Kane's approach to corruption was systematic and businesslike. Rather than simply bribing individual officers for specific favors, he had created a comprehensive network of corrupted law enforcement personnel who provided ongoing intelligence, protection, and operational support. Each corrupted officer received a monthly retainer, performance bonuses, and long-term financial incentives that made them stakeholders in the organization's success. "The beauty of our model," Kane explained to the assembled group, "is that we're not fighting law enforcement, we are law enforcement. When other criminal organizations have to worry about police raids and federal investigations, we're the ones conducting the raids and investigations." This statement wasn't hyperbole. Kane had used his position and network to orchestrate the takedown of 3 rival criminal organizations in the past 6 months. Each operation had been conducted under the guise of legitimate law enforcement action, complete with federal warrants, media coverage, and public praise for Kane's department's effectiveness. "Boss," interrupted Jake Morrison, who had been promoted to Director of Security, "we've got a problem with the Hernandez organization. They're moving product through our territory without paying tribute." Kane's expression hardened. The Hernandez cartel was a traditional Mexican drug trafficking organization that had been operating in southern Arizona for decades. They represented exactly the kind of disorganized, violent criminal enterprise that Kane's sophisticated operation was designed to replace. "What kind of volume are we talking about?" Kane asked. "Intelligence suggests they're moving about $5 million worth of product per month through Copper Valley County," Morrison replied. "That's unacceptable," Kane declared. "We've invested too much in establishing control over this territory to allow freelancers to operate without compensation." Kane's territorial control was another innovation that set his organization apart from traditional criminal enterprises. Rather than simply claiming territory through violence and intimidation, Kane had established legitimate control through his position as sheriff. He controlled law enforcement response, determined which crimes were investigated and which were ignored, and had the authority to seize assets and arrest competitors under the color of law. "Elena, what would be the financial impact of eliminating the Hernandez operation?" Kane asked. If we could take over their distribution network, we're looking at an additional $60 million in annual revenue, Vasquez calculated. Plus, we'd eliminate a security risk and send a message to other organizations about the cost of operating in our territory without permission. Miguel, what's your assessment of their operational security? Santos smiled grimly. They're old school, lots of violence, very little sophistication. They rely on fear and family connections rather than professional structure. Taking them down would be relatively straightforward. Kane nodded, his mind already formulating the plan. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to conduct a legitimate law enforcement operation against the Hernandez organization. We'll use our federal contacts to obtain proper warrants, coordinate with multiple agencies, and ensure everything is completely legal and above board. The room fell silent as the implications of Kane's statement sank in. He was proposing to use the full power of the American law enforcement system to eliminate a criminal competitor and seize their assets, all while maintaining complete legal cover. Sarah, I want you to coordinate with our D contacts. We need intelligence on Hernandez distribution points, financial assets, and key personnel. Make sure everything we gather can be used in court. Miguel, you'll provide tactical intelligence and help us understand their operational patterns. But I want you to stay completely clean on this. No direct contact with Hernandez people. No actions that could compromise the legal operation. Jake, you'll coordinate the actual takedown, work with federal agencies, ensure proper procedures are followed, and make sure we have overwhelming force available. I want this to look like the most professional law enforcement operation in Arizona. Kane's plan was audacious in its simplicity. He would use legitimate law enforcement tools to destroy a criminal competitor, seize their assets through civil forfeiture laws, and take over their territory and operations. The Hernandez organization would be eliminated, not through a criminal war, but through the application of legal process backed by federal authority. What about their assets? Asked Vasquez. Civil forfeiture, Kane replied. We'll seize everything: cash, vehicles, real estate, businesses. Under federal law, we can keep a significant portion of what we seize, and the rest will be distributed to participating agencies. It's completely legal, and it will provide us with both operational funds and additional money laundering vehicles. Over the following weeks, Kane's organization executed the plan with military precision. Using intelligence gathered through their network of corrupted law enforcement officers, they built comprehensive cases against key Hernandez operatives. Federal warrants were obtained through proper channels, with Kane's people providing the intelligence that justified the legal action. Takedown operation was a masterpiece of coordinated law enforcement action. Over 200 officers from multiple agencies participated in simultaneous raids across 4 states. The operation resulted in 37 arrests, the seizure of $12 million in cash, 43 vehicles, 6 properties, and 2 legitimate businesses. Kane held a press conference the day after the operation, standing behind a table loaded with seized drugs, weapons, and cash. This operation represents the kind of coordinated law enforcement response that these criminal organizations fear most, Kane announced to the assembled media. By working together across jurisdictional lines, we can dismantle even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The irony wasn't lost on Kane that he was using the destruction of one criminal organization to enhance his reputation and expand his own criminal empire. The seized assets would be legally distributed to participating agencies, with Kane's department receiving the largest share. The money would then be used to fund further expansion of his legitimate business fronts and corruption network. But the most significant result of the Hernandez takedown wasn't the money or assets seized. It was the message it sent to other criminal organizations operating in the region. Kane had demonstrated that he possessed something no other crime boss had: the full authority and resources of the American law enforcement system. Within weeks of the Hernandez operation, representatives from 3 other criminal organizations approached Kane's people seeking accommodation. Rather than risk the kind of comprehensive legal destruction that had befallen the Hernandez cartel, they were willing to pay tribute and operate under Kane's oversight. We're not just running a criminal organization anymore, Kane explained to his leadership team during their monthly strategy meeting. We're running a government. We have the authority to make laws, enforce laws, and punish those who violate our rules. We collect taxes in the form of tribute, we provide services in the form of protection, and we maintain order through the application of legal force. Kane's transformation was now complete. He had evolved from a corrupt sheriff taking bribes to the head of a criminal empire that operated with the full authority and protection of the legal system. His organization controlled territory not through violence, but through legitimate authority. They eliminated competition not through criminal wars, but through legal process. They generated revenue not just through illegal activities, but through a network of legitimate businesses that provided real services and employed hundreds of people. That $34 million stolen from the cartel had been transformed into a criminal empire worth over $200 million, with legitimate business interests, political influence, and law enforcement protection that made it virtually untouchable. But Kane's ambitions extended far beyond simple criminal enterprise. He envisioned a future where his organization would evolve into something unprecedented, a criminal government that operated within the framework of American law, providing services to both legitimate and illegitimate clients while maintaining complete legal cover. As he stood in his office, looking out over the territory he now controlled through a combination of legal authority and criminal enterprise, Kane reflected on how far he had come from the grieving widower who had first accepted cartel money to pay his wife's medical bills. That man had been weak, desperate, and morally compromised. The man who stood in his place was something entirely different, a criminal mastermind who had learned to use the very system he had sworn to protect as the foundation for an empire that would reshape the criminal landscape of the American Southwest. 2 years after the Hernandez takeover, Sheriff Marcus Kane stood in the penthouse suite of the Desert Crown Casino, the crown jewel of his criminal empire. The casino, officially owned by a consortium of legitimate investors, was actually the nerve center of an operation that now controlled criminal activity across 6 states and generated over $500 million in annual revenue. Kane gazed out at the sprawling lights of Las Vegas in the distance, reflecting on how his empire had evolved beyond his wildest original ambitions. What had begun as a desperate attempt to steal enough money to solve his personal problems had transformed into something unprecedented in American criminal history, a fully integrated criminal governmental hybrid that operated with complete legal immunity. "Boss," called out Alina Vasquez, entering the suite with a tablet full of financial reports. "We need to discuss the quarterly numbers and some emerging challenges." Kane turned from the window, noting the concern in his CFO's voice. "What kind of challenges?" "The good news first," Alina began, settling into one of the leather chairs around Kane's conference table. "Revenue is up 37% from last quarter. The casino operations are generating legitimate profits of $12 million per month. The construction companies have secured another $200 million in government contracts, and our protection services are now operating in 43 cities across the Southwest." Kane nodded approvingly. His protection services were perhaps his most innovative creation, a network of private security companies that provided legitimate security services to businesses, while also offering enhanced protection from criminal activities that Kane's organization either controlled or could prevent. "The money laundering operations are running at peak efficiency," Alina continued. "We're processing approximately $50 million per month through our various business fronts, with a clean return rate of 92%. "And the challenges?" Kane asked, though he suspected he already knew what Alina was going to say. "Federal attention," Alina replied grimly. "We've been so successful that we're starting to attract notice from agencies that aren't part of our corruption network." Kane had known this day would come. Success at the level his organization had achieved was impossible to hide indefinitely, and there were still honest law enforcement officers and federal agents who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Specifically, Kane prompted, "FBI Financial Crimes Division has opened an investigation into unusual cash flows in the Southwest. They're calling it Operation Clean Sweep, and they're looking at patterns of money movement that could potentially expose our laundering operations." "Do we have assets inside the investigation?" "Limited. We have one mid-level agent who's been providing intelligence, but the investigation is being run by Assistant Director Jennifer Walsh, and she's completely clean. No financial problems, no personal vulnerabilities, no history of corruption." Kane frowned. Jennifer Walsh was exactly the kind of law enforcement officer that posed the greatest threat to his empire. Competent, incorruptible, and backed by federal resources that even Kane's extensive network couldn't completely penetrate. What's their timeline? Kane asked. Unknown, but our source indicates they're moving quickly. They've already secured warrants for financial records from 12 banks across 4 states. Kane walked to his desk and activated the secure communication, a system that connected him to his key lieutenants across the organization. Within minutes, Sarah Chen, Jake Morrison, and Miguel Santos had joined the conversation via encrypted video link. We have a federal problem, Kane announced without preamble. Alina briefed them on Operation Clean Sweep. As Alina outlined the federal investigation, Kane watched the faces of his top people. These were individuals who had followed him from legitimate law enforcement into criminal enterprise, and their loyalty was absolute. But Kane could see the concern in their expressions as the scope of the federal threat became clear. Options? Kane asked when Alina finished her briefing. We could try to corrupt the investigation, suggested Sarah Chen. Find leverage on key personnel, offer financial incentives, or create distractions that force them to redirect resources. Walsh is clean, Kane replied, and the FBI has protocols specifically designed to prevent the kind of corruption we specialize in. What about eliminating the threat? Asked Jake Morrison, his military background showing in his direct approach to problem solving. Kane considered this option. His organization had the resources and capability to eliminate federal agents, but such action would bring down the full weight of the federal government in a way that even his extensive corruption network couldn't protect against. Too risky, Kane decided. Killing federal agents would trigger a response that would destroy everything we've built. Then what do you suggest? Asked Miguel Santos. Kane was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through the complex calculations that had made him the most successful criminal leader in American history. The federal investigation represented an existential threat to his empire, but it also represented an opportunity if handled correctly. We're going to do something unprecedented, Kane announced. We're going to cooperate with the federal investigation. The room fell silent as the implications of Kane's statement sank in. Boss Alina said carefully, I'm not sure I understand. We're going to provide the FBI with exactly what they're looking for, Kane explained. Evidence of a massive money laundering operation in the Southwest. But that would expose, Sarah began. Not our operation, Kane interrupted. We're going to create a fake money laundering network, populate it with our competitors and enemies, and hand it to the FBI on a silver platter. Kane's plan was audacious even by his standards. He would use his extensive intelligence network and law enforcement connections to fabricate evidence of a criminal conspiracy that would satisfy the FBI's investigation while protecting his own organization. Miguel, I want you to identify every independent criminal operation in our territory that hasn't agreed to work under our oversight. Sarah, coordinate with our law enforcement assets to create documentation that ties these operations together into a single conspiracy. Alina, we're going to need to create financial trails that lead the FBI exactly where we want them to go. Over the following months, Kane's organization executed the most sophisticated disinformation campaign in criminal history. Using their network of corrupted law enforcement officers, they planted evidence, created false financial records, and orchestrated a series of discoveries that painted a picture of a vast criminal conspiracy operating across the Southwest. The beauty of Kane's plan was that much of the evidence was actually true. There were independent criminal operations laundering money and conducting illegal activities. Kane simply connected these separate operations into a single narrative that satisfied the FBI's investigation while protecting his own empire. The key, Kane explained to his team, is to give them a victory that's big enough to justify their investigation but doesn't touch our core operations. The plan worked perfectly. Operation Clean Sweep resulted in the largest money laundering bust in FBI history, with over 300 arrests, the seizure of $2 billion in assets, and the dismantling of what the media called the most sophisticated criminal network in American history. Kane held a press conference alongside FBI Assistant Director Jennifer Walsh, accepting praise for his department's crucial role in the investigation. This operation demonstrates the importance of cooperation between local and federal law enforcement, Kane announced to the assembled media. By working together, we can dismantle even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The irony wasn't lost on Kane that he was being praised for helping to destroy a criminal network. while simultaneously operating the largest and most sophisticated criminal empire in American history. But the federal investigation had served its purpose. It had eliminated his competition while enhancing his reputation and providing legal cover for his continued operations. However, Kane's success came with an unexpected price. As his empire grew larger and more sophisticated, it required increasingly complex management and oversight. Kane found himself spending more time on legitimate business operations than criminal activities, and the line between his legal and illegal enterprises became increasingly blurred. "Boss," Elena said during one of their regular strategy meetings, "I've been analyzing our revenue streams, and something interesting has emerged." "What's that?" 68% of our revenue now comes from completely legitimate business operations. The casino, construction companies, security services, and real estate investments are generating more money than our criminal activities. Kane stared at the financial reports, realizing the implications of what Elena was telling him. His criminal empire had become so successful at operating legitimate businesses that it was no longer primarily a criminal enterprise. "Are you saying we've accidentally become a legitimate business?" Kane asked. "I'm saying that if we wanted to, we could shut down all criminal operations tomorrow and still be running a $500 million legitimate business empire." Kane considered this revelation. The boy who had started taking cartel bribes to pay his wife's medical bills had evolved into something he had never intended. A legitimate business mogul whose criminal activities were now just a small part of a vast commercial empire. But Kane also realized that his transformation had come at a personal cost that he was only beginning to understand. He had no family, no real friends, and no relationships that weren't based on fear, money, or mutual criminal liability. His success had isolated him in a way that his original poverty and desperation never had. That night, alone in his penthouse suite, Kane opened a bottle of wine that cost more than most people made in a month and toasted a photograph of his deceased wife Linda. "I kept my promise in a way," he said to her image. "I didn't let our situation destroy who I was. I became someone completely different." Kane had achieved something unprecedented in criminal history. He had built a criminal empire so sophisticated and well integrated with legitimate society that it had transcended crime entirely. He controlled territory through legal authority, eliminated competition through law enforcement action, and generated revenue through legitimate business operations. But as he stood in his luxurious suite, surrounded by the trappings of success that exceeded his wildest dreams, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that he had won a game that no longer mattered. He had become the most successful criminal in American history by ceasing to be a criminal at all. The $34 million stolen from a cartel transport had been transformed into a legitimate business empire worth over $1 billion. Sheriff Marcus Kane, the corrupt cop who had lost everything and decided to take it all back, had succeeded beyond his wildest ambitions. But success, Kane was learning, could be its own kind of prison. Legal disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and was created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.